September 3rd, 1792. A woman's head bobbed through the streets of Paris on top of a pike, her blonde hair carefully curled and powdered by a local barber who'd been forced at gunpoint to style it. The crowd cheered as the procession made its way through the city, stopping at taverns where drunken revolutionaries kissed the dead woman's lips. This wasn't just any execution. This was Princess Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan, better known as the Princess de Lamballe, and what had been done to her body before they mounted her head on that pike would make seasoned soldiers vomit. But 6 years earlier, Lamballe was living a completely different reality. At Versailles, she held one of the most coveted positions in France as superintendent of the Queen's household. Marie Antoinette had specifically created this position for her best friend, paying her an astronomical salary of 150,000 livres per year. To put that in perspective, most French peasants were starving on incomes of less than 500 livres annually. Lamballe was essentially being paid the equivalent of over $1 million in today's money, just to keep the Queen company. The friendship between Marie Antoinette and Lamballe had begun in 1774, shortly after the young Austrian princess became Queen of France. Lamballe was a widow at just 19 years old, left alone after her husband died from what was delicately called debauchery. The man had literally partied himself to death with prostitutes and alcohol. She was beautiful, wealthy, and from an excellent Italian noble family. She could have remarried anyone. Instead, she chose to dedicate herself entirely to the Queen. The two women were inseparable. They spent hours together every day, walking in the gardens, attending private concerts, hosting intimate dinner parties. Lamballe slept in apartments directly connected to the Queen's chambers. She accompanied Marie Antoinette everywhere, sat beside her at official functions, and was included in the most private family moments. The French court had never seen such an intense friendship between a queen and a lady-in-waiting. Naturally, rumors exploded. Pornographic pamphlets circulated throughout Paris depicting the two women in explicit lesbian encounters. These weren't subtle political cartoons. They were detailed, graphic publications with titles like The Royal Dildo and The Austrian Woman's Pleasures. Hundreds of these pamphlets flooded the streets, describing elaborate orgies at Versailles, where Lamballe and the Queen supposedly engaged in every sexual act imaginable. The French public, already resentful of the Austrian Queen, devoured these stories eagerly. The truth was far more innocent, but somehow more threatening to the established order. Lamballe genuinely loved Marie Antoinette as a friend, nothing more. But in a world where women were supposed to be devoted to husbands and children, a wealthy widow choosing female friendship over remarriage was deeply suspicious. Lamballe rejected dozens of marriage proposals from powerful nobles, preferring her independence and her bond with the Queen. This decision baffled and infuriated men who'd been refused, turning potential allies into bitter enemies. Inside Versailles, courtiers whispered about Lamballe's influence over the Queen. They blamed her for Marie Antoinette's frivolous spending, her Austrian sympathies, her withdrawal from formal court life. When the Queen purchased the Petit Trianon estate and created her private fantasy village where she and Lamballe would dress as shepherdesses and pretend to milk cows, the mockery reached a fever pitch. Here were the two most privileged women in France playing peasant while real peasants starved in the streets. Lamballe's official duties were minimal. She was supposed to supervise the Queen's household staff, but mostly she just existed as Marie Antoinette's companion. Her massive salary was pure favoritism, and everyone knew it. Other nobles who'd served the crown for decades earned a fraction of what this young widow collected for being the Queen's friend. The resentment festered in every corridor of Versailles. But here's what made the situation even more inflammatory. Lamballe flaunted her position. She wore dresses that cost more than most people's houses. She traveled in gilded carriages. She hosted parties where single meals cost enough to feed an entire village for a year. And through it all, she never seemed to notice or care about the growing anger in the streets of Paris. She lived in a bubble of privilege so complete that she couldn't see it was about to burst. By 1789, France was collapsing. The treasury was empty after decades of war and royal excess. Bread prices had skyrocketed while wages stagnated. Peasants were literally starving to death, while aristocrats like Lamballe lived in unimaginable luxury. The gap between the rich and poor had grown so extreme that revolution wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. But loyalty would prove far more dangerous than anyone imagined. July 14th, 1789. The Bastille fell, and with it, the old order of France began to crumble. At Versailles, panic spread through the palace as nobles fled by the dozens, abandoning the king and queen to save themselves. Lamballe's family in Italy sent urgent messages begging her to leave France immediately. Her brothers arranged safe passage, prepared documents, offered to send armed escorts to bring her home. She refused every offer. Marie Antoinette herself urged Lamballe to go. The queen understood what was coming better than her friend did. She knew that anyone close to her would become a target. She practically ordered Lamballe to escape while she still could. But Lamballe's response was always the same. She would never abandon the queen in her hour of need. This wasn't just loyalty. It was a death wish, dressed up as devotion. On October 5th, 1789, a mob of Parisian women marched to Versailles demanding bread. But they wanted more than food. They wanted the royal family dragged back to Paris, where they could be watched, controlled, humiliated. Lamballe was with the queen when the mob broke into the palace, when they murdered 2 of the queen's guards and paraded their severed heads on pikes outside her window. She saw the blood, heard the screaming, watched Marie Antoinette nearly collapse from terror. The next day, the entire royal family was forced into carriages and taken to Paris like prisoners. The journey took 6 hours through streets packed with jeering crowds. Lamballe rode in one of the carriages, watching the queen try to maintain dignity while people spat at them, screamed obscenities, waved the heads of the murdered guards. This was no longer the France they knew. This was something new and terrifying. In Paris, they were installed in the Tuileries Palace, which sounds grand until you understand it was essentially a gilded prison. Guards watched their every move. Their correspondence was read. Visitors were restricted. The queen, who once commanded the grandest court in Europe, was now a captive in her own capital. And Lamballe, who could have been safe in Italy, was trapped right beside her. The assembly passed new laws almost daily, each one stripping away more royal power. The king's authority evaporated. The queen's household was disbanded. Lamballe's position as superintendent was eliminated, her salary cancelled. She went from being one of the wealthiest women in France to having almost nothing. Her property was confiscated as national goods. Her Italian family could send her nothing without it being seized. But she stayed. Even as other ladies in waiting fled, even as servants disappeared in the night, even as former friends pretended they'd never known her, Lamballe remained at the queen's side. She lived in cramped quarters adjacent to the royal apartments, surviving on whatever food the family could get, enduring the daily humiliation of guards who treated her like a criminal. In 1791, the royal family attempted to escape France in the famous flight to Varennes. They disguised themselves as ordinary travelers and fled in the middle of the night. Lamballe wasn't with them. She'd been sent ahead to meet them at the border. But the king and queen were recognized and arrested. The entire escape plan collapsed. When they were dragged back to Paris in disgrace, their situation became exponentially worse. Now they weren't just prisoners. They were traitors who'd tried to abandon France. The assembly debated what to do with them. Some wanted immediate execution, others argued for a trial. Compromise was reached. The king would remain as a figurehead constitutional monarch, but the queen would be separated from her children and placed under even stricter guard. And anyone associated with the attempted escape, anyone who'd helped or encouraged the royal family, would be arrested. Lamballe should have been arrested immediately. She'd been part of the escape plan. She'd left Paris ahead of the royal family. But somehow, she slipped through the cracks and returned to the Tuileries. She moved back into her quarters near the queen as if nothing had happened. Guards questioned her, but she played dumb, claimed she'd just been visiting friends. They didn't believe her, but they couldn't prove anything. For months, she lived in this strange limbo. She was allowed to see the Queen, but always under supervision. Every conversation was monitored. Every letter was read. They couldn't be alone together for more than a few minutes. The intimate friendship they'd shared for nearly 2 decades had been reduced to stolen moments under the watchful eyes of hostile guards. In August 1792, everything collapsed. Paris exploded in violence as radical revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries, massacring the Swiss guards who protected the royal family. Over 600 soldiers were butchered defending the palace. The king and queen were arrested and separated. Marie Antoinette was taken to the Temple prison with her children, and Lamballe was dragged to La Force prison, reserved for the most dangerous aristocratic criminals. La Force was a medieval fortress that had been converted into a holding facility for nobles awaiting trial. But trial was a generous word for what awaited prisoners there. The revolution had moved beyond law and order into pure chaos. Radical leaders like Marat and Hébert were calling for blood, demanding that all aristocrats be eliminated before they could conspire with foreign armies to restore the monarchy. Lamballe found herself in a cell with 2 other noble women, all of them terrified, all of them knowing that rescue wasn't coming. The guards made it clear that they weren't there to await trial. They were there to die. The only question was when and how. The mood in Paris was murderous. Mobs roamed the streets looking for aristocrats to lynch. The slightest rumor could trigger a massacre. On September 2, 1792, news reached Paris that Prussian armies had crossed the border, threatening to attack France and restore the monarchy. Panic exploded across the city. Revolutionary leaders spread rumors that aristocratic prisoners were planning to break out and join the invading armies. The solution, they declared, was simple: kill all the prisoners before they could escape. Lamballe could hear the mob forming outside La Force. She could hear the screaming as they stormed the prison gates. She could hear prisoners being dragged from their cells and murdered in the courtyard below. The September massacres had begun, and she knew exactly how this would end. But what happened next went far beyond simple execution. September 3rd, 1792, early morning. Lamballe was dragged from her cell by men who could barely stand upright from drinking. The September massacres had been going on for hours, and the courtyard of La Force prison was already slippery with blood. Bodies were piled against the walls. Severed limbs lay scattered across the cobblestones. The air smelled like a slaughterhouse. She was brought before what they called a tribunal, though it was nothing more than a table set up in the prison courtyard, with drunk revolutionaries sitting behind it pretending to be judges. The president of this tribunal was a man named Hébert, who would later become famous as the editor of a radical newspaper. Right now, he was just another bloodthirsty mob leader looking for aristocratic heads to claim as trophies. The proceedings were a sick joke. There was no defense attorney, no evidence presented, no witnesses called. The entire trial lasted less than 5 minutes. Hébert looked at the papers in front of him, saw that Lamballe was the former superintendent of the Queen's household, and smiled. They'd caught a big fish. He asked her one question, and one question only. "Will you swear an oath of hatred against the king, the queen, and the monarchy?" This was the test. It was designed to be simple. Just say yes, denounce your former employers, spit on the memory of your friendship, and you might walk out alive. Dozens of other prisoners had taken this oath already. It was pure theater. Nobody cared if you meant it. They just wanted the symbolic victory of making aristocrats publicly reject everything they'd once stood for. Lamballe knew exactly what she was being asked to do. She understood that her life depended on her answer. Everyone in that courtyard went silent, waiting to hear if the Queen's best friend would betray her to save her own skin. The moment stretched out, unbearable in its tension. She refused. Not dramatically, not with some grand speech about honor and loyalty. She just looked at Hébert and quietly said she couldn't take that oath. Her voice was steady. She wasn't crying or begging. She simply stated that she couldn't, in good conscience, swear hatred against people she loved. Then she went silent. The crowd erupted in rage. How dare this aristocratic whore refuse? How dare she choose loyalty to the Austrian bitch over her own life? The men behind the tribunal table stood up, shouting over each other. Hébert declared her guilty of treason against the French people. The sentence was obvious: death. But here's where things took a turn into something far worse than simple execution. A voice from the crowd yelled that she should be guillotined like the other aristocrats. But someone else shouted back that the guillotine was too good for her, too quick, too merciful. She was the queen's whore, they screamed. She needed to suffer like the people had suffered under royal tyranny. The mob agreed enthusiastically. Hands grabbed Lamballe and dragged her toward the prison gates. She tried to resist, tried to pull away, but there were too many of them. They were taking her outside, into the streets, where the real horror would begin. The tribunal guards made no attempt to stop it. They just watched, some of them laughing, as the crowd pulled her through the gate and into the Paris morning. What happened next was witnessed by hundreds of people. This wasn't a secret murder in a dark alley. This was a public spectacle, performed in broad daylight on the streets of Paris, with crowds cheering and participating. Multiple eyewitness accounts exist, and they all describe essentially the same nightmare. The mob dragged Lamballe to a pile of corpses that had been thrown out of the prison. They stripped her clothes off, tearing them away while she tried desperately to cover herself. She was 43 years old, and her body was being exposed to a howling crowd of strangers who saw her not as a human being but as a symbol of everything they hated about the old regime. Then the sexual assault began. Multiple men raped her, while others held her down against the bodies of dead prisoners. This went on for an unknown amount of time. Some accounts say minutes, others say it lasted over an hour. Lamballe was conscious through all of it, screaming, begging them to just kill her and end it. But they weren't done with her yet. When they finally tired of the rape, someone pulled out a knife. Not a sword, not a guillotine blade, a regular knife, the kind you'd use to cut meat at dinner. They were going to decapitate her, but they were going to make it slow. The man with the knife wasn't an executioner. He was a butcher from Les Halles Market who'd joined the mob that morning looking for aristocrats to kill. He pressed the knife against Lamballe's throat and started sawing. She was still alive, still conscious, still feeling everything. The blade was dull, and it took multiple attempts to cut through. Eyewitnesses reported that she screamed with each stroke, that her body convulsed, that blood sprayed across the cobblestones in pulses timed with her still beating heart. It took nearly 2 minutes of sawing before her head finally separated from her body. But even death didn't end the violation. The crowd wasn't satisfied with just killing her. They wanted to mutilate her, to destroy every part of her that had once been beautiful and privileged. Someone cut open her dress and sliced off her breasts. Someone else used a knife to mutilate her genitals, carving away at her body while screaming about how she'd been the queen's lover. They pulled out her intestines and draped them over nearby fence posts like decorations. The crowd was in a frenzy now, passing around pieces of her body like trophies. Some people dipped their hands in her blood and smeared it on their faces like war paint. Others cut off locks of her blonde hair to keep as souvenirs. A few even tried to eat pieces of her flesh, though most were too drunk to actually manage it. Then someone had an idea that would make this murder infamous across Europe. They took Lamballe's severed head and jammed it onto a pike. But just mounting a head on a pole wasn't dramatic enough. Someone ran to fetch a barber who lived nearby. The barber was dragged out of his shop at gunpoint and ordered to style the dead woman's hair. Picture this scene. A professional hairdresser, shaking with fear, being forced to comb and powder the hair of a severed head while a mob of drunk murderers stood around watching and critiquing his work. He curled her blonde hair, applied powder to make it look fashionable, even tried to arrange her face into a more peaceful expression. The entire process took nearly 20 minutes, while Lamballe's mutilated body lay in the street, still bleeding. When the barber finished, the crowd cheered. Now they had their trophy, properly styled and ready for display. But the real purpose of this grotesque parade was still to come. The mob lifted Lamballe's head high on its pike and began marching through Paris. This wasn't a random wandering. They had a specific route planned and a specific destination in mind. They were going to take her to see the Queen. The procession wound through the streets of Paris, growing larger as it went. More people joined, eager to see the spectacle. Shopkeepers came out of their stores. Children were lifted onto parents' shoulders to get a better view. People leaned out of windows, cheering and throwing things. This was entertainment, a festival of death celebrating the destruction of the old aristocracy. At every tavern, the mob stopped to have drinks. They would prop the pike against the wall and order wine, toasting to the death of tyranny. Drunk revolutionaries would kiss Lamballe's dead lips, stick their tongues in her mouth, grab her hair, and shake her head around like a puppet. Some made crude jokes about how she'd been better looking alive. Others suggested more creative ways they could have killed her. But the parade had a darker purpose than just celebration. The mob was making a circuit of Paris, stopping at specific locations to send a message. They went to the homes of known royalist sympathizers and thrust the head up to their windows, screaming threats about what would happen to anyone who supported the monarchy. Most people wisely stayed inside with their shutters closed, but a few were dragged out and forced to kiss the head or face immediate execution themselves. The level of violence in Paris that day was beyond anything the city had ever seen. The September massacres would kill over 1,400 people in just 5 days. Prisons across the city were being stormed, their inmates dragged out and murdered in the streets. La Force, where Lamballe had been held, saw 160 prisoners killed in a single day. The Abbaye prison lost 300. The Châtelet another 200. Paris had become an open-air slaughterhouse. Bodies were everywhere. They lay in gutters, piled in courtyards, stacked against walls. The Seine River ran red with blood as corpses were thrown into it. Dogs and rats fed on the dead in broad daylight. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of blood, excrement and rotting flesh that hung over the city like a fog. Even battle-hardened soldiers who'd seen war found themselves vomiting in the streets. But Lamballe's death stood out even in this carnival of carnage. Most prisoners were simply hacked to death with swords or axes, brutal but relatively quick. Lamballe had been specifically selected for prolonged torture because of who she was. She was the Queen's friend, and her suffering was meant to send a message about what happened to anyone who stood by the monarchy. As the mob made its way through Paris, word spread about what they'd done to her. Pamphlets describing her rape and mutilation appeared within hours, sold on street corners like souvenirs. Artists sketched her severed head from memory. Poets wrote verses celebrating her death. The revolution was documenting its own atrocities, turning them into propaganda. By mid-afternoon, the mob reached its ultimate destination, the Temple prison, where Marie Antoinette was being held with her children. This was the whole point of the parade. They wanted the Queen to see what had been done to her best friend. They wanted her to know that the same fate awaited her. The Temple was a medieval fortress that had been converted into a maximum security prison for the royal family. The king was held in one tower, the Queen and her children in another. They were kept separate, allowed to see each other only rarely and always under guard supervision. Marie Antoinette's life had been reduced to a few small rooms, where she spent her days sewing, reading, and trying to keep her children from understanding how desperate their situation had become. She knew something was happening. She could hear the mob outside, the cheering and shouting. Guards had been running through the hallways all morning, looking nervous. But nobody had told her what was going on. The revolutionaries wanted her to be surprised, to be unprepared for what they were about to show her. The mob positioned themselves in the courtyard below the Queen's window. They lifted Lamballe's head high on its pike, making sure it was clearly visible. Then they started chanting, demanding that the Queen come to the window. They wanted her to see. They needed her to see. This was their triumph, their ultimate humiliation of the woman they blamed for France's suffering. Marie Antoinette heard her name being screamed by hundreds of voices. Against her better judgment, against the pleading of the guards who tried to stop her, she went to the window and looked down. What she saw destroyed her. There, mounted on a pike, and carefully styled by a professional barber, was the severed head of her best friend. Lamballe's dead eyes seemed to stare directly up at her. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream. Her blonde hair, perfectly curled and powdered, blew gently in the breeze. Below the head, the mob was holding up other body parts, her breasts, her intestines, pieces of her clothing soaked in blood. Marie Antoinette fainted. She collapsed to the floor so hard that guards thought she'd died. When they revived her, she was incoherent, screaming and crying uncontrollably. She kept asking if it was real, if that was really Lamballe, begging someone to tell her this was a nightmare she could wake up from. But the mob wasn't satisfied with one viewing. They kept the pike raised, kept shouting for the Queen to look again. Guards tried to keep Marie Antoinette away from the window, but she kept going back, as if she couldn't believe what she'd seen, as if she needed to confirm the horror was real. Each time she looked, the mob cheered louder, celebrating her anguish. This psychological torture continued for hours. Even after the mob finally dispersed, taking Lamballe's head with them to parade through more neighborhoods, Marie Antoinette couldn't recover. She stopped eating. She stopped speaking. For days, she just sat in her room, staring at the wall, trapped in the memory of what she'd seen. The guards later reported that the Queen aged a decade overnight. Her hair started going white. Her face developed lines that hadn't been there before. She moved like someone much older, broken in body and spirit. Seeing Lamballe's mutilated head had destroyed something fundamental in her, some last bit of hope that maybe this nightmare would end without complete disaster. But the nightmare was just beginning, and Marie Antoinette's suffering would soon make Lamballe's death look like mercy. The mob wasn't finished with Lamballe's remains. After displaying her head to the Queen, they continued parading through Paris for another 2 days. The head stayed mounted on its pike, carried from neighborhood to neighborhood, tavern to tavern, becoming increasingly decomposed as time passed. The September heat accelerated the decay. Flies swarmed around it. The flesh started turning gray. The carefully styled hair became matted with blood and dirt. But what made this extended display particularly grotesque was how it was used. Revolutionary leaders seized on Lamballe's head as a propaganda tool. They commissioned artists to sketch it, poets to write about it, newspapers to describe the justice that had been served. The head became a symbol, proof that the aristocracy could be destroyed, that no amount of wealth or beauty or royal friendship could save you from the people's rage. Street vendors sold miniature pikes with crude dolls representing Lamballe's head. Children played games mimicking her execution. Theaters staged performances reenacting her death, with actresses screaming as fake blood splattered across the stage. The revolution had turned a woman's brutal murder into mass entertainment. Meanwhile, her body remained where it had fallen in the street outside La Force prison. Nobody bothered to move it. For 3 days, it lay there in pieces, exposed to the elements and to anyone who walked past. Dogs tore at the flesh, crows picked at the organs that had been pulled out and left scattered around. Passers-by stepped over and around the remains like they were garbage. Some revolutionaries actually posed with the body for sketches. There are documented accounts of people having their portraits drawn standing triumphantly over Lamballe's mutilated corpse, one foot planted on her torso like a hunter with a trophy kill. These sketches were then sold as souvenirs of the September massacres. The September massacres finally ended on September 6th, when revolutionary leaders realized the killings had gotten out of control. Over 1,400 people had been murdered in 5 days. The prisons were empty. The streets were filled with rotting corpses. Paris smelled like death, and even hardcore revolutionaries were starting to feel sick about what had been done. Orders went out to clean up the city. Bodies were collected and thrown into mass graves. The blood was washed from the streets. Life was supposed to return to normal, as if 1,400 murders could just be swept away and forgotten. But Lamballe's body was handled differently than the others. Because she'd been so publicly displayed, because her death had become so symbolic, revolutionary authorities decided her remains needed special treatment, not out of respect, out of continued contempt. Her body parts were collected and thrown into an unmarked pit in the Madeleine Cemetery, mixed in with dozens of other executed aristocrats. No ceremony, no prayers, no marker to indicate who was buried there. Her head, however, continued its journey. After days of being paraded through Paris, it was finally removed from the pike and also thrown into the mass grave. But by that point, it was barely recognizable as human. The decay had been so severe, the damage so extensive, that what went into the ground looked more like a piece of rotten meat than a person who had once been called the most elegant woman in France. Marie Antoinette, locked in the Temple prison, didn't know these details. She didn't know what had happened to Lamballe's body. She only knew what she'd seen from her window, that horrific image of her friend's severed head that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The Queen's mental state collapsed completely after that day. Guards reported that she would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, seeing Lamballe's dead face in her dreams. She stopped taking care of her appearance. Her hair, once her greatest vanity, was barely combed. Her clothes went unwashed. She moved through her days like a ghost, barely speaking, barely eating, just waiting for her own death. And death was coming. The revolutionaries weren't satisfied with destroying the Queen psychologically. They wanted her blood too. On October 14th, 1793, exactly 1 year and 41 days after Lamballe's murder, Marie Antoinette was put on trial. The charges were absurd. She was accused of everything from treason to incest with her own son. The trial was even more of a farce than Lamballe's had been, lasting 2 days, but with the verdict predetermined from the start. Marie Antoinette was found guilty and sentenced to death by guillotine. Unlike Lamballe, she would get a quick execution, not out of mercy, but because the revolutionaries wanted to maintain the fiction that they were administering justice, not committing murder. The guillotine was their symbol of enlightened, rational punishment, and they couldn't have the Queen's execution turn into the kind of mob violence that had killed her friend. On October 16, 1793, at 12:15 in the afternoon, Marie Antoinette was beheaded in the Place de la Révolution. She was 37 years old. Her head was held up to the crowd, which cheered just as loudly as they had for Lamballe's. Her body was thrown into an unmarked grave just like her friend's had been. The irony was brutal. Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, died more quickly and with less suffering than her lady-in-waiting. Lamballe had been raped, mutilated, slowly decapitated with a dull knife, and had her body parts paraded through the streets. Marie Antoinette got a clean blade and instant death. In the perverted logic of revolutionary France, the Queen received more humane treatment than the woman who'd simply been her friend. But here's something that wasn't discovered until much later, something that makes Lamballe's death even more tragic. When historians finally examined the medical records and eyewitness accounts from September 1792, they found evidence that Lamballe had been pregnant when she was killed. Not far along, maybe 2 months, but definitely pregnant. This raises disturbing questions that have never been fully answered. Who was the father? Lamballe had been essentially celibate for years, dedicating herself entirely to the Queen. She hadn't remarried after her husband's death. She'd turned down every suitor. The most likely explanation, though it was never proven, was that she'd been raped by guards at La Force prison before the September massacres began. Sexual assault of female prisoners was common, and Lamballe had been held for weeks before her murder. So not only did the mob rape and murder her, they also killed her unborn child. A child that would have been born into hell, certainly, but a child nonetheless. Lamballe died pregnant, alone, violated in every possible way, her body torn apart and displayed as a trophy, and she endured all of that because she refused to betray a friend. The men who killed her were never punished. Most of them went on to have successful careers in revolutionary France. Hébert, who'd presided over her mock trial, became a powerful newspaper editor until he was eventually guillotined during the Terror's internal purges. The butcher who'd sawed off her head with a kitchen knife went back to his job at Les Halles Market. The men who'd raped her disappeared into the Paris crowds, anonymous and untouchable. France moved on. The revolution consumed itself, with radicals executing moderates who were then executed by more extreme radicals in an endless cycle of violence. The terror claimed tens of thousands of lives before it finally burned itself out. Napoleon eventually seized power and restored order, transforming the Republic into an empire that looked suspiciously like the monarchy that had been overthrown. But Lamballe wasn't forgotten entirely. Her death became famous across Europe as an example of revolutionary excess. Royalists used her story as propaganda against Republican government. This is what democracy looks like, they argued. This is what happens when you give power to the mob. Artists painted romanticized versions of her death, turning the brutal reality into tragic beauty. Poets wrote verses about her loyalty unto death. The truth was far uglier than any painting could capture. In 1816, after Napoleon's fall and the restoration of the French monarchy, King Louis XVI ordered a search for the remains of executed royalists. They found the mass grave in the Madeleine Cemetery, where Marie Antoinette, Lamballe, and hundreds of others had been dumped. The bodies were so mixed together, so decomposed after nearly 25 years, that identification was impossible. They collected all the bones they could find and reburied them in a new cemetery with proper Catholic rites. Marie Antoinette got a grand monument. But Lamballe's remains, assuming they were even among the bones collected, were never individually identified. She was just dumped back into another mass grave, this time with a prayer said over it. Even in death, even after the monarchy was restored, she remained anonymous. The autopsy reports from 1792 had been destroyed or lost during the chaos of the Revolution. The evidence of her pregnancy disappeared with them. The men who'd witnessed her death were all dead themselves by 1816. What had really happened to her became muddled with legend and propaganda. Royalists made her into a saint. Republicans dismissed her as another privileged aristocrat who got what she deserved. But recent historical research has uncovered documents that paint a more complete picture of her final days. Letters from other prisoners at La Force describe how Lamballe was targeted by guards, how they knew she was the Queen's friend and wanted to break her. Testimony from the September massacres mentions her specifically, describes her refusal to denounce Marie Antoinette, confirms the rape and mutilation that eyewitnesses had reported. What emerges from these documents is a woman who made a conscious choice to die rather than betray someone she loved. She had multiple opportunities to save herself. She could have fled to Italy years earlier. She could have taken the oath denouncing the monarchy. She could have lied, said whatever they wanted to hear, and potentially survived. Instead, she chose loyalty, even though loyalty meant the worst death imaginable. Modern historians debate whether this was admirable or simply stupid. Was Lamballe a martyr who died for friendship, or was she a deluded aristocrat who couldn't accept that the old world was gone? Did her loyalty mean anything, or was it just the privileged delusion of someone who thought aristocratic bonds mattered more than survival? The answer probably lies somewhere in between. Lamballe was definitely privileged and probably naive about the reality of revolutionary violence. But she was also genuinely loyal to Marie Antoinette in a way that transcended self-interest. She loved her friend, and when forced to choose between that love and her own life, she chose love. Whether that makes her noble or foolish depends on your perspective. What's undeniable is the sheer brutality of what was done to her. The rape, the mutilation, the parade through Paris with her severed head. None of that was necessary. She could have been executed quickly like thousands of others during the terror. Instead, she was selected for special torture because of who she'd been friends with. Her death was designed to send a message, to terrify anyone who might still support the monarchy. And it worked. After Lamballe's death, the few remaining royalist sympathizers in Paris went completely silent. Nobody wanted to risk becoming the next head on a pike. The September massacres effectively terrorized the entire city into submission. For months afterward, people were afraid to even whisper criticism of the revolution for fear they'd end up like the princess. But here's the deepest irony of Lamballe's story. She died to protect and support Marie Antoinette. gave up her life rather than denounce the Queen. And Marie Antoinette, watching her friend's severed head being waved outside her window, learned absolutely nothing from it. She didn't recant, didn't cooperate with her captors, didn't try to save herself. A year later, she went to the guillotine just as stubbornly as Lamballe had gone to her death. So what was the point? 2 women died for a cause that was already lost. The monarchy wasn't coming back. Louis XVI had been guillotined months before Lamballe's murder. The revolution had already won. Lamballe's loyalty didn't save the Queen. The Queen's dignity didn't restore the monarchy. They both died horribly, and nothing changed except that France had 2 more bodies in unmarked graves. The revolutionaries who killed Lamballe claimed they were striking a blow for liberty, equality, and fraternity. But what they actually did was rape and mutilate a woman who'd committed no crime other than being friends with the wrong person. They turned her death into entertainment, paraded her body parts through the streets like carnival attractions, and then dumped her remains in a pit like garbage. This is what the revolution really looked like behind all the noble rhetoric. Not heroic citizens rising up against tyranny, but drunk men with knives sawing off a woman's head and raping her corpse. Not justice, but murder dressed up in political language. Not liberation, but terror used as a tool of control. The September massacres killed 1,400 people in 5 days. Most of them were priests, nobles, and ordinary criminals who had nothing to do with politics. Many were women and elderly men who posed no threat to anyone. They were slaughtered not because they'd committed crimes, but because they represented the old order, and the old order had to be destroyed completely before the new one could be built. Lamballe became the face of that slaughter. Her death was so excessive, so unnecessarily cruel, that it shocked even hardened revolutionaries. Foreign newspapers wrote about her for weeks, describing in graphic detail what had been done to her. European monarchies used her story as proof that the French Revolution was nothing but barbarism disguised as political reform. And they weren't entirely wrong. The revolution did achieve important things. It ended feudalism, established new legal principles, created the foundation for modern democracy. But it also unleashed horrific violence that consumed thousands of innocent people. Lamballe's death embodied that contradiction. A woman who represented aristocratic privilege, destroyed by a mob that claimed to represent justice, in a manner so brutal that it revealed the mob's own capacity for evil. The final bitter irony is this. Lamballe is remembered today mostly because of how she died, not how she lived. Her friendship with Marie Antoinette, her elegance, her kindness, all of that has been overshadowed by the grotesque spectacle of her murder. She became famous for being raped and decapitated, for having her head paraded through Paris on a pike. The revolutionaries wanted to erase her, and instead they immortalized her, but as a victim rather than a person. Her body was never properly buried. Her remains were mixed with hundreds of others in mass graves that were dug up, moved and reburied multiple times over the decades. Whatever was left of Princess Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoie-Carignan is now scattered across Paris in pieces, mixed with the bones of people whose names we'll never know, in graves that have no markers. She was 43 years old when she died. She spent the last 6 years of her life watching the world she knew collapse, refusing to abandon the friend who'd been at the center of her life for nearly 2 decades. She chose loyalty over survival, friendship over safety, and paid for that choice with the worst death the revolution could devise. And in the end, absolutely nothing changed. The Queen still died. The monarchy still fell. France still descended into years of terror and war. Lamballe's sacrifice meant nothing in the grand scheme of history. She was just one more corpse in a revolution that produced corpses by the thousands. That's the real horror of her story. Not just how brutally she died, but how pointlessly. She gave everything for nothing, and the men who killed her went home to their families that night, had dinner, went to sleep, and woke up the next morning to look for more aristocrats to murder. To them, she wasn't a person. She was just another symbol that needed to be destroyed. The day Paris lost its head wasn't about justice or revolution or political change. It was about a mob of angry, drunk, frightened men taking out their rage on a woman who couldn't fight back. Everything else, the rhetoric about liberty, the pretense of trials, the claims of revolutionary necessity, was just window dressing for murder. And that's the truth they don't teach in history classes. That's the reality behind the grand narrative of the French Revolution. Sometimes history's great movements are just excuses for ordinary cruelty carried out on an extraordinary scale. Sometimes the people who claim to be fighting for justice are just looking for someone to hurt. And sometimes loyalty and friendship and love mean absolutely nothing when faced with a mob that wants blood. Princess de Lamballe learned that lesson in the most horrible way possible, and her severed head, carefully styled and mounted on a pike, became the symbol of a revolution that devoured its own humanity in the name of creating a better world.